faster. Okay, we're recording. Hi everyone, Joe Levy. I'll be your moderator for today's session, Student Affairs Assessment Leaders Structured Conversation for the month of September, Mindful with Measurements using Qualitative and Quantitative Data and Assessment. We'll have a moderated conversation among our panelists and save time for Q&A at the end. These are the main outcomes for our session, although we may cover a lot more than this. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to our amazing panel, starting with Ciji Heiser.
Hi everyone, I'm Ciji Heiser. I'm the Director of Assessment and Effectiveness at Western Michigan University in Student Affairs. Prior to my time at Western Michigan, I spent several years at UNC Chapel Hill doing assessment work in their division of Student Affairs, and I am rapidly approaching the deadline for defending my doctorate on October 15th. And my dissertation or my doctoral degree is in educational research methodology, and I'm focusing on cultural responsiveness and quantitative measures.
Thanks, Ciji. Kick it over to Ross.
I'm Ross Markle. I'm the founder and managing director of a company called DIA Higher Education Collaborators. My background has sort of wavered in various aspects of academics, student affairs, student success. I did my doctoral work at James Madison University, where I learned how to do student affairs assessment under one of our attendees, Sarah Finney, who is absolutely phenomenal and amazing, and I want to give her a shout out while she's here. Yeah, so I'm excited to have a conversation today.
All right, Kate, go ahead.
Okay, Joe, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate McConnell, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Research and Assessment and the Director of the Value Institute at the Association of American Colleges and Universities, otherwise known as AAC&U. Prior to joining AAC&U, where I've been, I woke up in August and realized I've been here 5 years now, but I spent about a decade at Virginia Tech working in assessment, evaluation, and serving as affiliate faculty in the graduate program in educational psychology. So that's the lens through which I view a lot of this work around assessment, methodology, teaching and learning. So I'm really excited to be here. I have not worked explicitly in student affairs assessment, but had some excellent collaborators. Some of you may know Martha Glass at Virginia Tech. If you don't, get to know her. She's phenomenal. And just excited to be part of the conversation and truthfully, bridge the conversation between academic and co-curricular assessment. That certainly was the intent behind a lot of the value rubrics, lo those many years ago when they were created. And I see that as an untapped or undertapped area for work in this space. So thank you for having me be part of this.
And we're happy to have you. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so we're gonna dive right in. I think it's helpful as we get started on this conversation to help set foundation with data types. And so this first question is really looking at, what are the differences, pros and cons, considerations for appropriateness when it comes to qualitative versus quantitative data. And so I'll start it with Ross, since he wrote the article and it seems appropriate for him to kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Joe. I think, and this is where, I should preface this by saying the article, the blog post that Joe referred to, kind of my premise in writing it is this thought that I've had for a couple of years now, and I've slowly bounced it off of people, and no one's really corrected me yet. I'm open to the idea of the conversation, but I was writing a chapter for the Student Affairs Assessment book that Zeb Davenport and Vicki Wise put together, and they asked myself, my co-author Javara Russell, to sort of cover all things like data and measurement and stat analysis in one chapter, and that was 25 pages, by the way. They gave Sarah Finney, I think, 25 pages just to write about learning outcomes. I felt a little jaded. But in any case, we wrote the whole thing, and then they came back and said, we need you to now cover every one of those topics from a quantitative and qualitative perspective. So the task was already daunting, and they made it exponentially more challenging. And as I started sort of polishing up on qualitative methodology, you know, one of the things I kept reading about was that the fundamental assumption of qualitative research is that the human experience is too individualized to quantify. Quantification is creating a common code for our experiences. You can put my weight on the same scale as your weight because we've agreed that pounds are a common unit of measurement. And so the blog post was really saying, I don't think we can do qualitative approaches for student learning outcomes because qualitative is individual, student learning outcomes are common. And so that's kind of my point about this is really that I think the term qualitative data is somewhat of an oxymoron because a qualitative approach might be individualized. We might take student writing samples that are individual, but when we put the rubric on them, once we quantify them, we've now deviated from the qualitative approach. And again, I say this is a conversation. I'm not dictating or trying to educate. I'm open to be informed. But my whole point is, if you're taking student learning outcomes, you're starting with something that is common, and you've violated one of the fundamental assumptions and beliefs behind qualitative research. So if you want to use qualitative methods, I think that's okay, but you've got to kind of understand where you're getting the most sort of epistemological bang for your buck, if you will. And I think that if you start with something qualitative and then go use a quantitative approach, you maybe have mixed your methods in a not the good way that we always talk about mixed methods. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that was kind of my thing I wanted to get out when I say, I think data are data. If we talk about appropriateness, it's got to start with the sort of philosophical underpinnings of the approaches that we use. And so if we violate one of those, that sort of moves me away from that type of approach.
Knowing you're immersed in the studies right now, Ciji, do you have a response either to build off of Ross's response or to the question posed?
Yeah, I think I was reading Ross's post again this morning, and I think there are parts of it that really spoke to me as somebody who does appreciate the mixing of methodologies. And I think that I was also going back and looking at some of my literature from Stake, who's writing about this into his 80s and probably has a lot more to say on all of this than maybe than any of us ever will. But I was reading through that, and this idea that I think that it's the two methodological approaches are not quite as dichotomous and devoid of one another as we like to think that they are. And I think that it's easy to oversimplify. And I think often when people ask me the difference between quantitative and qualitative, that the most simplistic way to talk about it is that qualitative is about narrative and quantitative is about numbers. And I think the point that I struggle with is that assigning a number or counting something makes, I think, how I read your post and as I'm listening to you talk, Ross, assigning a number to something kind of rips you out of that qualitative approach and plants you firmly in a quantitative approach. And I think that there's a lot more underpinnings. There's a theoretical underpinning to taking a qualitative approach that extends beyond just kind of a count or aggregating some information. I think that where I have started to learn in my own work and in my own studies is the role that qualitative can play in helping us understand validity and specifically concepts of validity, where we can start to understand valid for whom and start digging a little more deeply. And I think that is kind of the essence of qualitative, is to ask more deep questions that are heavily contextualized. I think quantitative is really it really allows us to make gross generalizations, broad generalizations that are almost decontextualized. And I think qualitative is a little bit the opposite of that, in that it's heavily, heavily contextualized. And it allows us to understand our instrument, or whether it's a rubric, whether it's a heavily standardized survey or a test, it helps us understand who those are valid for. And I don't think that we can always do that using quantitative measures. I think we have to ask those questions. We have to interact with humans to understand their perspectives and if those tools hold and measure the same constructs across diverse populations.
Turn it over to Kate to see if she has any thoughts before bouncing it back to.
Sure. No, thank you. And, anytime you're in a webinar and a discussion where you get to talk ontology and epistemology, I'm game. So I just put my hand up for that on a regular basis. What I really appreciated about Ross's blog, and I have to say, Ross, I didn't realize this before we started chatting, but it doesn't surprise me that you come from the JMU assessment program, given kind of the lens through which you're viewing things and the collaborators you've referenced. And, one of our collaborators is a faculty member there, John Halfcoat, who, the JMU folks, Keston, Sarah, John, help keep us honest at AAC&U when it comes to how we psychometrically describe value. But apart from going into value, stepping back and looking at the framing, I think I fall on Ciji's side in the sense that I actually really, there are a couple of things as it was presented that kind of piqued my interest from a discussion point within your blog. One is I actually, with apologies, think we've presented a bit of a binary description between qualitative and quantitative, and I really think of it as more of a continuum. To say that there's no standardization in some qualitative approaches, I think is actually not accurate. There's a lot of work done on, intercoder reliability on different things, where it may not ever involve quantification or labeling with numbers, but you're actually looking to look at patterns across these experiences through methodologies that are more qualitative in their approach. I agree with you that there are some learning outcomes for which there may be solid agreement, or at least solid definitions. For example, in educational psychology, there's an entire thread, an entire subfield, so to speak, on critical thinking. Is it domain specific? Is it generalizable? And how is it defined? And how can it be measured? And there are multiple ways of measuring critical thinking, a rubric being just one of them. And some really powerful tests out there that folks have used to, different effect, the critical, I think it's called the CAT test, the critical thinking test out of Tennessee Tech, for example, pretty robust instrumentation there. But I would say that even with student learning outcomes, as it comes to higher education and assessment, there are those outcomes for which we don't necessarily right now have those fully developed definitions and consensus ideas that lend us to an immediate close-ended measurement tool. Think of the difference between, you referenced written communication, the difference between that and say lifelong learning, which is something we espouse in a lot of the work that we do. And we're trying to wrap our hands around, our arms around what this looks like and what counts as evidence when it comes to actually being able to describe the learning experience and learning gains of our students. And the one thing I worry about when we talk about this is, I tend to not say, and this may be my middle position, I think of myself as a jack of all trades researcher, in that I'm more focused on the methodology that fits the problem, the question, the task, versus saying I'm a quant person, I'm a qual person. And so it's not so much a preference for qualitative, but it's, are the questions I'm asking better married with a qualitative approach and consideration versus a quantitative? A beautiful, well-constructed, psychometrically sound test is an amazing tool, and I love them because of the things I can do with them statistically, analytically. But when you start talking about assessment on campuses beyond, the conversation around standardized tests or what have you, and tests that we use, there's still a lot of noise in the ether on quant methods some of our faculty might use, just from a lack of their own ability to design really sound quantitative instruments versus the more open-ended assignments we might be talking about. So I think between the two, I kind of look for that, what fits the questions I'm asking, and what's the range of methods we might have, for anything. So for me, it's not what works best for student learning outcomes assessment. It's much more specific to what works with this particular student learning outcome.
So much of what you shared there, Kate, is helpful, and I want to make a summary point here and then tee up Ross for a response. One is, one of the things that for me in looking at the article that I think is, and even the discussion so far today, is there's another continuum to think about as well, which is research, assessment, and evaluation. And there's certainly some schools of thought, and I've been in some presentations and written some things around what that, I believe it to be a continuum. Some people firmly believe they're separate things or they're all the same thing. But I think that it's important to at least mention that here, and we don't have to delve into it too much, but I think it's a piece of the context as well, because that's one of the things I've seen, whether on the quant side or on the qual side, that when thinking about assessment, people will come from a research lens when the purposes behind the work may be very different, right? Often research is for, understanding a phenomenon and potentially generalizing it for, a larger population, whereas assessment is a lot more intended and contextualized for the institution, the student population there, the intervention itself. But one of the other things that was, an interesting wrinkle in the, and what really piqued my interest with Ross's post was not just the idea of qual versus quant, but specifically the context of and the role that qualitative data and its appropriateness in not just assessment, but specifically student affairs assessment. And so I want to tee up Ross to respond there, because I know that was part of the purpose of your post and to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, I think first off, to pull in Kate's point and to your explication there, Joe, use is obviously critical, and I think this is where kind of understanding the field is really important, because like our old school theories of validity were that validity was an intrinsic property of the measure, that you built a valid test. And kind of this is what Ciji was saying, is like, well, valid for who, valid for what? Those use aspects are a more emerging, and actually I shouldn't say emerging, they're now part of the educational and psychological standards for test development, that the use of the assessment is as much a part of the validity argument as anything. I would say, in reference to sort of I think assessment and research are good examples of where use, in my mind, in the student learning outcomes context, really shows why I think more robust quantitative methods are needed, because we're often saying, I think faculty and staff and people in student affairs all over the place, whatever the construct is, we look at tests and surveys, and I'm putting air quotes around that if you can't see that, and we say, this doesn't look like what I want students to be able to do, so it's not valid. And so we go to more rubric-based approaches, or quote unquote qualitative approaches, because they look more authentic. We don't understand that what we're going to use those things for at the end of the day, whether it's assessment or research or evaluation, are to make statements about groups of students in many cases that are going to be aggregated, statistically analyzed and compared, presented to whomever to say, we did what we said what we were going to do, we didn't do what we said we were going to do, here's the change we're going to make, you should give us funding, whatever the conclusion might be. That's the validity question that I think is most pertinent. And it's not, does this look like what I think a measure of this thing should look like? It's, what is this going to do to inform our process at the end of the day? And to your point, Joe, I think data are data. They're good or they're bad, kind of, and I don't think there's a lower or differential standard of, you can use these because it's just our local assessment question. I think the only thing that's a real kind of room for wiggle there is, if you're in an assessment or an evaluation context, or even a research context, do you have the room, so to speak, to evaluate your measurement? So can you pilot something or administer something, and at the end of that conclusion say, we didn't see the results we wanted to see, but we think that it's based on this quirk or insufficiency of the measurement that we used. You'll get that sometimes in assessment, depending on the stakes of your context. You can often make a research paper out of that. In evaluation, that's maybe the case where you don't always have the wiggle to say, like, hey, we did made our deadlines for this grant, but we think it's because our survey didn't work. So can you give us another year of money to figure that out? I think that's the only thing that changes the stakes of validity or reliability, is if you have the opportunity to review those questions.
Thanks, Ross. And you mentioned methods and measurements, and so I think it tees us up for this next question of rubrics, what they are, how they should be used. And I want to first give the floor to Kate, given AAC News huge value rubric framework and resource. And so if you want to talk a bit about that, and then rubrics, and we'll open the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to double down on Ross's hope, aspiration that there are more robust quantitative measures out there? Because yeah, absolutely. I think that would be an excellent complement to the suite of tools that are there, right? Like what you will never hear from AAC&U is that the value rubrics are the only way to assess, or that this is a single data point. And, you know, I think that's actually one of the bigger challenges as we work with campuses to build institutional capacity to use them appropriately, be it for local use or for participation in our nationwide scoring, is following some of the methodological tenets to try to ensure that what they're using actually is something that by design, by reconsideration of its purpose and making sure that, you know, the assignments match the rubrics, that there's, you know, scorer training going on, all of that good stuff, even locally, that they're being used appropriately, right? So I think that's, you know, the big thing that certainly I think we all agree on when it comes to this. But what I would say about the rubrics is not just, you know, should rubrics be used as a tool, right? What I think the bigger thing from an AAC&U perspective when it comes to the larger question of validity, because I agree, it's much more than just face validity with a faculty member looking at a test and saying, well, this isn't what I do in my class. And that, you know, that's a non-helpful conversation, so to speak. But it's, you know, long ago as 2016, Bob Shireman, you know, who was, he's focused mostly on affordability and policy things and education under, you know, Clinton and Obama, and he's with the Century Foundation now. He had a paper out about, you know, just the fact that as we're looking at all these multiple measures are out there, and he was saving most of his, you know, ire, if you want to call it ire, for things like, you know, the proficiency profile, the CLA, the broad construct, you know, tests that we're talking about, not subject specific tests like the major field tests that, you know, ETS has, those kinds of things. And he made the point that, you know, our students spend the majority of their time in actual class environments as part of a curriculum or a co-curriculum. And there are thousands of tasks that they're asked to do as part of these environments. And those tasks can broadly be called assignments that have been designed by faculty with disciplinary expertise to further the learning. And this is actually what we as academics, you know, the experiences that we've intentionally designed, you know, not talking the quality of the assignments, but the idea that they've been intentionally designed to foster learning. We're missing an opportunity if we're not looking to see what learning is taking place and what sense we can make of what students have done and gained, you know, by ignoring the fact that, you know, there is this, you know, potential body of evidence, you know, translating it with a rubric qualitatively, quantitatively, you know, how you make sense of it, but that we're ignoring this whole aspect of our educational experience that we're saying is valuable from tuition dollars, valuable from our design perspective around curriculum programs and entire institutional approach to undergraduate education. And so that's really where the rubrics come in to help, or other mechanisms when we talk about authentic and being able to pull from what students are actually doing and see what that reflects reflects outwardly, and look for patterns of learning that we can discern there. I do agree with Ross's argument, and we talked about this previous to our webinar, and it was certainly part of the conversation, is unfortunately in the 10 years of value, and we've been guilty of doing this, is making somehow antonyms out of authentic and standardization, which, you know, I agree, that's language we need to finesse and change, because it's not so much, standardized tests have been taking so many whacks. I think it's this very easy dichotomy, kind of what Ciji said about her definitions of qualitative versus quantitative. You know, quantitative numbers, authentic non-standardized, and that's a misnomer, that's a mislabeling, and I agree with that completely. But the idea of using the rubrics to translate learning from what is actually happening in the lived curricular and co-curricular experience of the students, I think is an important part of our conversation, and an important value, no pun intended, that we should be espousing. You know, whether or not we have the perfect tool to make the perfect translations is, you know, a different question, and one I'm willing to engage in, but not looking at that as part of the evidence for assessment, program evaluation, et cetera, I think is a huge missed opportunity.
But I do think part of the challenge goes back to use, because those classroom assignments are developed by faculty to measure learning within the context of the class. Or, you know, and to bring it back to the student affairs, like most of my co-curricular work has been in, you know, civic engagement, multicultural competence, those sort of broad constructs that exist across the institution. And really, you can't pin down on one curricular or co-curricular experience. And I think part of the problem is we've adopted those rubrics in an effort to say, here's a piece of evidence we have that looks like a piece of evidence that we want in terms of this performance, but then we're going to make an inference based on that classroom assignment about what students can do across the institution. And I know, Kate, when you guys are involved and working with institutions as part of the Value Institute, you know, you're coaching them up on how to do that well. What I get concerned about is when we're administering this without that guidance and saying, we've got the value rubric, which I love the rubrics, I love the frameworks, and I want to give AAC and you credit for that and have used them in a lot of my writing. But I worry about the institutions that just say, well, we have this piece of evidence, let's slap a rubric on it. And I know you're not a fan of that as well, but I think that's what we have to be concerned about. And the only thing I'll add to the what are the rubrics conversation, and I know Joe loved this from the blog post, is rubrics are both standardized and quantitative. And if we don't understand that, we're missing some of the important assessment measurement knowledge that underlies these tools that we're trying to use. Because a rubric has put common language across all of your students. You have standardized that. You're going to use numbers. You're going to make comparisons based on those rubric scores. Those are quantitative approaches. I do not care how rich and authentic the experience is that you're putting that rubric onto. From an assessment perspective, the use of the value rubrics and almost any rubric that isn't a 0 or 1 is quantitative in nature. And I think we miss that point in many cases.
So before you bounce over to Ciji, Joe, I just want to respond to that. So first and foremost, it's not just something I'm not a fan of, but using the rubrics inappropriately or using them in ways that gets campuses what I'll call dangerous data. Data that then informs decisions that may be completely faulty and inappropriate and cost time and resources and maybe cost students opportunities for learning. My concerns about implementation are probably as equally strong as yours. But what I will push back on a little bit there is that notion of, and it may be semantics. So again, in the end, everything that Ross is saying, there's pieces of it that I do agree with, but the semantic difference that I'm looking at on two fronts. One, the notion that all rubrics are a priori quantitative, I don't think is accurate, because we chose to put numbers as labels. Like, these numbers do not represent the same kind of numbers you would generate from other methodologies. And we could have just as easily left them out and just had the descriptors, and then it would have been a totally qualitative tool. And frankly, that's one of the ways that I do know some programs are using them. Disciplinary differences in paradigms with research actually come out and inform assessment practice. So I know more, shall I say, less positivistic or more qualitatively focused disciplines, when they're taking the rubrics and using them themselves to inform their praxis, I've had them remove the numbers. I've had them, change the boxes. We present, on one hand, there's this notion of customization to make it fit your context, et cetera. Where we really get concerned is when folks are trying to extrapolate and using things inappropriately quantitatively, from a sample size, the idea that assessment is amethodological, and you hear that in some of the reports, or it comes through, is a really dangerous assumption to me. So that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to participate in this conversation is, methods do matter. Whether or not we talk about assessment is different from research, how we do assessment absolutely matters. And there are assumptions and tenets to all of these approaches we have to take into account. But I do push back on the notion that all rubrics are a priori by their nature quantitative. And then I think the standardization language that we use is we talk about the rubrics as being standards without standardization. And to be truthful, I think what is the best explanation of how we're using that language is it's not that the rubrics aren't a common language that we're using. It's that the rubrics are then being applied in ways that, frankly, our methodology doesn't control for. right? In the sense that we're not saying you have to use this common prompt or these 5 questions like an AP exam that will be scored. We're not saying these are the 5 assignments that you have to use, or here's your range of 10 that you can use. And that really goes back to more pedagogical and epistemological decisions around this, from that perspective of going back to how can we raise up what students are actually doing and interrogate them about learning. So I agree with you. The language from the rubrics, there's a standardization in the rubrics, but as an overall approach, there are pieces where we've in some ways thrown the doors open and made things a little messier by design, absolutely, because we want to account for faculty autonomy, academic freedom, disciplinary differences, designs. The overarching idea, though, with the classes is not, and I would never say you can pinpoint one aspect, one learning outcome to one class or one experience. What we're looking at these assignments and these classes to serve as is more snapshots. Opportunities where there is an assignment that aligns with the value rubric. If you think about general education, the whole design of the curriculum is that these classes are not just about the content, they are about these overarching learning outcomes, and they're contributing to that. And so, trying to marry that notion within a disciplinary class for these overarching outcomes that you see the rubrics assessing is really what we're trying to harvest in that space. So agree with you to a point on some of what you've articulated about rubrics, but I think that's where you would see the difference in terms of at least the AAC&U perspective on quantitative and standardization. So I don't know if that makes sense or sounds like too many angels dancing on the head of a pin, but that's kind of our lens on that.
Ciji.
Yeah, I want to chime in. I think I echo Russ's concern about how we implement tools and where that can cause problems. I think that and I want to broaden that to say that I think that extends well beyond the rubrics. If you have a culturally responsive set of questions in a focus group, but you go in and you lack cultural competence as the facilitator of that focus group, you're going to have some problems. And that would create, and I really like your term, Kate, I'm hoping I might use it in some more context, that idea of dangerous data. I think that haphazard implementation is a problem, and something that we talked about when we were preparing for the webinar is that there are gaps in the profession that we have fantastic organizations and foundations that are trying to help fill, but that's not the same as developing competence in assessment, evaluation, or research. Just because you have access to SurveyMonkey doesn't mean you're a survey researcher or know the basic tenets of designing a tool. And so I think that that's where that haphazard implementation can come in, is that just because you have a tool doesn't mean you have a really strong knowledge base on how to use it. And I think that like I'm listening to what Kate was saying, AAC&U is doing their best, and this too, Russ, to go in and help facilitate that learning and appropriate implementation. But I think the same that could be said for standardized surveys, especially in terms of bias. And I saw that comment, so I'm trying to bridge some of the things happening in the chat with our conversation here. And yeah, bias is everywhere. It is absolutely in qualitative approaches, because the researcher themselves serve as the instrument rather than a survey or a rubric, right? So that the human being is the one doing the data collecting and making meaning out of that information. And there are ways to increase the reliability or increase the missing my words, the credibility and the trustworthiness of that information once collected from a qualitative approach. But the bias, I think where bias creeps in standardized tools is that sometimes we often assume that tools that have been generated in a predominantly Western context make sense for all of our students. And some of our tools were designed decades ago, and the process for that is really rigorous. And I have all the psychometric training, like I understand all of that. But I think when we fail as those who purchase tools in student affairs and deploy tools, when we fail to critically examine whether or not they make sense for our cultural populations, as we've seen drastic shifts in the diversity in higher education, I think we fail our students, and we fail in an opportunity to examine bias before we purchase something or before we launch something to our student base that could that is a biased instrument and doesn't really appropriately gauge the learning of our students who are more diverse. So I just wanted to chime in with that kind of that piece of bias and standardization as well, that it's not limited to these rubrics certainly or qualitative measures. And there's definitely an element of that in standardized measures and surveys as well.
Yeah, I just have one quick point, Joe, and I think it goes back to your comment, Kate, about kind of standards versus standardization. And I think there's one really like direct kind of nitty-gritty thing we rarely talk about, and it's that I think a lot of our assessment approaches are attempted to be implemented without a lot of invasion, and standardization it's an invasion. It's to say, look, I know you've been doing it this way. We need you to do it this way so that we can make an inference across students. And my concern when you take those snapshots as you put them is, one of the classic examples is omission. Like if a faculty member turns in an assignment that doesn't address a point on the rubric, does that mean the student didn't develop that skill, or that that wasn't asked as a part of the assignment? So especially when we talk about co-curricular student affairs assessment and looking across students, making claims about our institutions or programs or whatever it is as a whole, we have to be aware that it can't always just be nice and easy to grab what's there and try to use that as a snapshot or a piece of evidence, because we need to make those claims and be able to. So sometimes we run into problems in implementation simply because we don't want people to do anything extra for assessment, but sorry, that's sometimes what we have to do.
Well, and I will say, I think a lot of that actually came out of the value added, and not value, the statistical value added operational modality of assessment when I first started in the field. It was pre-post test, this is what you have to report on, and the implementation of that on campuses, at least within the Virginia system where I was working, having those kind of binary methodologies dictated to us, when then there was an opportunity to say, let's look at course embedded. I'll be perfectly honest, I engaged in what I now will call assessment malpractice, where I went to faculty and said, don't worry. You're already doing this in your class. Just give us what you're doing and we won't interfere. And it's not this bureaucratic thing that you remember, and it's da-da-da-da-da-da. And that's, we didn't do ourselves any favor when we were trying to do that. But to be perfectly honest, that's when really it was assessment driven by accountability, by regional accreditors, by those pressures versus the design. And so to your point, where our interventions are now focused is really on that notion of assignment design and assignment alignment with the rubrics. If you're intending to use what you're, and this is a narrowing of a focus to a certain degree, in that if you think of scorer training as something we control, the rubrics we control, the royal we of AAC&U. If we want to revise, we can tweak our training. The assignments have been the black box for years. And as we started doing this at the national level, we realized we really needed to start to interrogate the assignments themselves. And that's not to say an assignment, you can have a beautiful assignment pedagogically that is just a bad fit with critical thinking. For student affairs perspectives, one of the biggest missed opportunities, we had a ton of institutions early on look to do assessment with civic engagement. And then the papers they turned in were civics papers, which did not align with the rubric. It was much more, what does a bicameral legislative process look like than what is civic engagement that co-curricular professionals would recognize. And so the variables there's a suite of variables that we have developed and collect to try to get at those nuances of our messy zero. What does a zero represent with a value rubric? It's really no evidence, because and this is where, God bless John Hathcote, his head explodes as we talk through how to navigate this. He's one of our consulting methodologists, a faculty member at JMU. Zero could be that the student can't get to the benchmark level from a learning demonstration level, or it can be that the faculty member didn't ask them to do it. And if they didn't ask them to do it, what does that zero represent? And so we've tried to build out some variables and reporting mechanisms around that. But, both of you, Ciji, Ross, I think this is actually, when I look at the field of assessment, I think this is one of our bigger issues that we have to wrestle with as professionals. And, when we get taken to task overall by an article in Inside Higher Ed or someone in the New York Times saying this just feels widgety, mechanistic, non-meaningful, unreliable, invalid, there's an element to truth to that, in the sense that if it's not done well and there's not the design and the consideration of what this should be, there's legitimate questions and issues there. I mean, there's good assessment and there's bad assessment. And I think we need to start not just pointing fingers, but actually articulating what it looks like and helping people fill gaps where there are gaps. Or at least recognize that when we ask people to be assessment professionals, when you look at the job description for any assessment professional, especially those at institutions that you're talking about an office of one, I mean, you're almost asking for the holy grail. You're asking for someone with a PhD in higher education, psychometrics, teaching and learning, and hopefully some kind of discipline that other faculty will recognize as well. You want them to write accreditation reports beautifully. You know, you want them to be able to do the methods consulting, but then collaborate with faculty and students potentially, and not offend anyone in that process. And so I think there's a lot of, it makes perfect sense to me as a field that we're here and we're having these conversations given kind of the timeline and the trajectory of how this field evolved. But I do think in some ways there's probably going to be some specialization in different categories around assessment professionals and what that looks like, and making sure we're not conflating things like, you know, if you're an assessment person, maybe you're not the accountability person, you know, or you know, that we demand a lot of the same role, but they implicate different skills and abilities. And the same person chasing things down for a SAAL standard may or may not be the same person working from, you know, qualitative, quantitative, whichever, a methodological perspective on gathering evidence of student learning. So it's tricky. It's exciting, but it's tricky.
So I need to apologize right now in the sense that I really probably should have scheduled this one for 90 minutes instead of 60, but it's just too much fun talking with this group. So in light of that, since we have about 10 minutes left, the last two big questions were around, you know, considerations for selecting methods or considerations for implementing methods. And so if we could maybe just get like either a tip for that or your kind of final thoughts from each panelist, and then because I do want to make sure to give at least some time for the participants to pose some questions. So let's go down the line. Let's start with Ross.
I think I'll go for my tip, and this was one of the things that I emphasized in the blog post, which is dangerous data, I think, is a really important thing to say, and this stuff is really important. And I feel like oftentimes assessment professionals are kind of, there's so much to do, there's so much methodology. I'm not a psychometrician, so I'm gonna do this. And I think I talked a lot in the blog post about don't let these certain things guide, these limitations of your knowledge or expertise guide you to a methodology. Like, because I don't know how to build an awesome critical thinking test or civic engagement survey, I'm just gonna use a rubric. No, like know what you're doing, partner with assessment professionals, look at best practice. I know it's just easy for me to say, like, be smarter and know more about assessment, but I think it's my greater caution is, like, try to read up and see what's been done out there rather than trying to just be intimidated by the body of knowledge. Folks like myself and Kate and Ciji and Joe and Renee and Sarah Finney, I mean, there are people who, if you email us and say, I'm trying to do this, what would you recommend? We'll help you. And it's, you know, that's my biggest recommendation is don't try to do this alone. Don't try to, you know, play with fire, because you'll end up getting some dangerous data, which is, I'm also stealing that term.
Ciji.
I'll jump in and say, like, I'm on the don't do it alone bandwagon, and I'm just coming from another angle. So I would say pull together if you have time. And Ross said this earlier, like pilot your things. Do not just buy something and deploy it to 30,000 people and hope for the best. Like, take a minute to road test that with your population. And I think especially in student affairs, we have so much access to students. It is not, it's almost taken for granted, right? Like, it's not that hard to reach out to a student group that you advise and ask to put something on their agenda and get their feedback on a tool that you may be taking. Like, pull together a group of a consulting body of students, a stakeholder body of students that is culturally representative of your student body, and ask them to give feedback on something, ask how it may be interpreted. I took an instrument to a residential housing association one time, and I had designed 20 questions, and every single one they gave me great feedback on except one. And they were like, no, if you ask it like this is what students are gonna say if you ask it like that. So it was a great opportunity to road test they also then negotiated to have one of their own questions added, which was a lot of fun. It was a great opportunity to work with them. But you have access in student affairs to so many students to solicit their opinion and their feedback on tools and how they could be perceived. I think it's a really good opportunity to take advantage of that. And I think Kate said something earlier that was really important too. Like, it's about training before implementation of tools. And I think that's really important to know how to appropriately implement a given tool and draw meaning from it after you've implemented it.
Kate.
So I think that my takeaway from this is kind of twofold, or what I would say for advice is, number one, and I think you'd hear threads of this from Joe and Ciji, is this doesn't happen by magic. Okay, it's like, good teaching is not just because someone was a born performer and they stand up on, at the lectern. It's all, if you take away nothing else, it's by design. And so your design considerations, need to really be looking at, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What is the question we're trying to answer? And the second piece that I would suggest is, particularly for assessment professionals, be methodologically open. There are, as I said, some really powerful multiple choice tests. There are some excellent surveys out there. There are excellent qualitative prompts on the student affairs, student development side. If you want to go through a really, really rigorous training that's mind-blowing, that then does actually get you some numbers, the subject-object interview training, from Keegan. You want to talk self-authorship, you really go all the way back to Keegan and his training. Man, it blew my mind in graduate school and as an assessment professional. And you want to talk, rigor. I think that, to me, is probably the biggest takeaway. It's not, oh, that's just a multiple choice test or that's just a rubric. It really is, what are the fundamentals of the tool that you're using? Was it well designed and well crafted? Has it been piloted? Has it been vetted? What are the psychometric properties, if those are available, or what are the qualitative markers that might tell you it's trustworthy and credible? Like, do your homework with your methods, be open to lots of different tools, and make sure you have more than one, because it's that old trope, just because you have a hammer, not everything's a nail. Make sure you're doing what makes both epistemological, methodological, philosophical, and pedagogical sense when you're talking student learning.
Right. Thank you all. Want to take the remaining time for folks who might have questions. Feel free to chat those, or in a moment, as long as it's not too much, raise your hand or indicate that take your video, turn your video on so that we can see. I don't just want to say unmute because I don't want like a lot of people to start talking. But yeah, really want to see what questions, comments folks have. I do want to share the contact info of our speakers today, so you can always follow up with them directly. And we had some great resources shared in the chat.
Joe,
and yeah,
I'm so sorry, real fast. I just want to put a plug in. If you're looking for some comparative information around measures, you might check out AIR, the Association of Institutional Research. They used to put out a publication on all those different tools that were available, from surveys to tests, etc. I honestly don't know if they still do that, but there might be some resources there as well, just to put that plug in.
thanks. Any burning questions from?
We must have covered it all, that no one has a question.
Well, so I'm going to be selfish and just put this plug out there. If you've used a value rubric and you've customized it, one of the things that we're doing is, and that's always been like part of the permission, like take it, make it yours, change it, revise it. And you have examples that you want to share, please send them to my email. My research associate is actually collecting and collating those. That would be really great information. And then again, any examples of how you're using some of this stuff from student affairs assessment, knowing we tend to be more heavily in the curricular side, particularly how you would frame assignments on the co-curricular for assessment. that would be hugely beneficial. And if you are doing some cool stuff and are interested in doing a webinar, we'll just turn the tables and put you on an AAC-NU webinar to talk about assignments in co-curricular. So feel free to put your hand up for that. Maybe email Joe or your network you all know who's doing cool stuff. Let us know. We'd love to showcase it.
Jarek, I see your video. Do you have a question?
Hey, good morning. Well, yeah, good afternoon. Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Jarek Janjo. I'm from Santa Ana College. I'm the SAAL coordinator. And I think that, just sort of like, without getting into the weeds of it, I'm just at awe at comments that I heard. We simply don't talk about assessment or rubric creation, in the terms I just heard today. So I'm just utterly impressed. But really sort of like the question that comes to my mind is how do I bring this discussion home? Because it seems like we've been talking about SLO assessment for about 15 years, and coming to colleges in California. I mean, the topic has been contentious to say the least. So the question that I would have, and I think that Kate alluded to this, where is the horse's mouth? Like, what are we to do? This is psychometrics, assessment. I mean, doubt rubrics. I mean, I can't go home and just kind of like say to faculty, hey guys, there is yet one more world for you to explore, and all it takes is time. So I just would, sort of like this down to earth, advice, if you don't mind.
I think I'll echo what Kate said, which is, kind of combined with mine in terms of keeping your options open. A lot of the stuff I think that we choose, and I was trying to respond to Shannon and Patty in the comments, but I think sometimes we like course-based assessments because it's what we know, right? And we know how to build rubrics, and other things we don't know. And so we apply, it's confirmation bias. We might apply criticisms to the new technique that we don't necessarily put the same lens on the things we already use, and vice versa. And I'm as guilty of it as anyone. So I think, and combined with Ciji's comments, piloting. So I mean, entering in assessment is a process of improvement, right? So no matter what you're going to do, learn from it, continue to improve, be open-minded. And I think we always hold ourselves to the standard of like, this has got to be the thing that works. We've got to capture it perfectly. It's got to work for every student. When the real question is like, come back to assessment as a question. We're trying to figure out if our students are learning or not. And if we aren't able to answer that, or we don't like the answer, then we can continue to revisit it. But I think coming in with this idea that there's one best way, I mean, Ciji, Kate, and I, and Joe, we're quote unquote experts, but we clearly don't identify one best way to do it. So talking with people, considering the pilot, et cetera, and I agree on the bias factor. I mean, it's certainly something that we have to consider, we can't remove, but I don't think that we should be kind of ignorant enough to think that one of our methods is going to be a quick path to getting rid of that as more so than another.
The only other suggestion I would make, and this is something that worries me from a pragmatic perspective, is student learning outcomes assessment can be a very siloed thing. And it's often, one of my biggest worries with course-based assessment is that it too readily defaults to the convenience sample. Like, I know who's going to play ball with me. I know who's interested in this. I can horse trade. Maybe they have an NSF grant. I'll write their evaluation proposal. And then, again, and that goes to use, right? And how you've set it up, depending on what you're trying to do with this data, that's really not helpful. It's also often completely de-identified from any of the student characteristics you might want to know about. Like, how many credit hours has the student completed? It's a senior level class or a gen ed class, but I have seniors and sophomores in there. Is there a differential performance in that area? So thinking through robustly what else you need to know about the assignment, because just pulling an assignment and using a rubric, even if the assignment aligns well, but you don't have any other information associated with it, there's not much you can necessarily do with it. And some of the things you might do would be incorrect, attributing blame to a particular class for not doing what it should be doing, et cetera. There's some interesting examples, and if folks want, feel free to email me, of campuses where you've had the integration of value-related data into some predictive modeling for student success, pairing it with looking at retention, graduation, that sort of thing. Simply having the, in some ways, regional accreditation because it is the separate standard. You know, they want it as a separate standard for us to do it, and then we do it, but we keep it separate. So there's some interesting ways of integrating it into planning and decision-making processes beyond just faculty development for a course or program. And so email me and I can send some examples or put you in touch with people.
All right. Well, thank you all so much, Derek. Thank you for the question. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, folks who've hung on. We've gone over our time here. I shared a link in the chat of, you know, if we want a part 2 of this conversation or a new take on the conversation, SAAL always welcomes suggestions for future structured conversations. Likewise, we are always happy to feature guest blog posts. So if you would love to re-engage or elaborate on you know your stance on anything we've discussed today, feel free to check out our website and offer up a blog post if you'd like to engage in that way. Thank you to our panelists and for our folks who came here. We had, at one point I saw 96 people in the session, and then you know we're recording this, so more folks will watch online. But thank you all. Such awesome conversation, and yeah, stay tuned for future information from SAAL about our next structured conversation. Otherwise, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
It was so nice meeting all of you. Have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, take care, everybody.